Hello, everyone. It's Tony Kube with the Justice for Immigrants campaign. I have a few seconds after the top of the hour, 1 o'clock. Thank you today for this webinar. Thank you as well to my great colleagues working on Catholic issues. First of all, Bodner with USCCB Domestic and Social Development, and Christopher Ross with Catholic Charities USA. Before we get started, I see that there are some folks still trying to get onto the webinar here, but before we get started, let me go over a few housekeeping items, okay? Folks are muted so that we can have a clearer presentation for the afternoon. There is a chat box at the bottom of your screen, and there it is, there's the chat box. It's on the right-hand corner of your screen there. And so if you have any questions for our presenters today, please go ahead and type your question in the chat box, and we'll get to them when we can. There's going to be some time built into the presentation and at the end so that folks can, so that the presenters can answer your questions regarding the webinar. Okay. Also, this webinar is going to be available on the justiceforimmigrants.org website, the presentation itself, as well as a recording of the audio of the webinar, audio and video of the webinar. So it'll be available hopefully tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then likely Monday. Okay, so without any more delay here, I'm going to go over and introduce Julie with USCCB's Office of Domestic and Social Development. Julie is going to provide you with some background on this HUD proposed rule. She's going to talk about she's going to give an overview of the rule as well as current policy and the proposed rule. So, Julie, you might need to press *1 to unmute your phone. Julie, are you on?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. Like Tony said, I'm going to start off by giving us some background on the issue. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, led by Secretary Ben Carson, has issued a proposed rule that aims to further restrict eligibility for federal housing assistance based on immigration status. And we are deeply concerned about this rule. The Church teaches that access to safe, decent, and affordable housing is a human right. Housing is not just a market commodity, it's a basic social good. And because it's a basic right, the government has a role to play in its provision. So this rule really threatens the stable housing of mixed status families, so we're urging HUD to withdraw it. The proposed rule was issued on May 10th of this year, and the important thing to note is that it's a proposed rule, meaning it hasn't been implemented yet. So when a rule is first proposed, it goes through a process before it can get implemented. And right now, the proposed rule has been published. And the purpose of that is to notify the public and give us an opportunity to respond and submit comments. And the public has 90 days to submit, so that means we have until July 9th, which we'll talk more about later. Then HUD's going to review the comments, and ultimately they have to decide how to move forward based on all of these comments, on scientific data, on expert opinions, and on facts accumulated during the pre-rule period and the proposed rule stage that we're in now. So this rule is responding to an April 2018 executive order from the Trump administration that says all agencies should, and I quote here, adopt policies to ensure that only eligible persons receive benefits and enforce all relevant laws, providing that aliens who are not otherwise qualified and eligible may not receive benefits. So the rule aims to make sure only eligible individuals are receiving benefits in HUD Section 214 programs. And it's specifically targeting mixed status families. So those are families with at least one citizen or qualified immigrant and at least one person who's not qualified for assistance. And one thing that I want to clarify as we talk about this rule is that someone who's ineligible for housing assistance in these rooms is not necessarily undocumented.
Next slide, Julie.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know how to advance.
Yeah. No. Just let me know when you want to get to the next slide.
Thank you. So I want to get a little into the weeds here just so you know what we're talking about. These are the housing programs that this rule would affect, and they're Section 214 programs. So they're public housing, which has about 2.1 million residents, and public housing comes in all shapes and sizes, so everything from scattered single-family houses to high-rise apartments, and it's administered by a network of local public housing agencies. And then there are Section 8 housing choicers, and these help people with the lowest incomes afford housing in the private housing market by paying landlords the difference between what a household can afford to pay and their rent, up to a reasonable amount. So this is HUD's largest rental assistance program, and it assists about 2.2 million households. And then another program is Section 8 project-based housing. So this is produced kind of through a public-private partnership, and it builds and maintains affordable rental housing. And the assistance for this is attached to a specific property. And this program serves about 1.2 million households. Really, these three programs that are in bold are the ones we're talking about today. The rest of the programs listed are also affected, but for the most part, they're older programs that aren't fully active. So there are some units that are still on the market that have been grandfathered in, but most of the people affected are receiving assistance through public housing or a Section 8 program. And next slide.
Julie, before I advance to the next slide,
yes.
There's some folks who are having difficulty hearing the audio. So for those folks, I typed in the telephone number and the access code you can use to hear the audio for the webinar. So folks, please look in the chat box here. The number is 917-338-1451, and the code is 257772#. There you go, Julie. Thanks.
Thanks. So again, to get into the weeds about what we mean when we talk about eligible residents, the people who are eligible to receive assistance in these housing programs are U.S. citizens and nationals, lawful permanent residents, VAWA self-petitioners, asylees and refugees, parolees, persons granted withholding, removal or deportation, victims of trafficking, individuals residing in the U.S. under compacts of free association with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau, and immigrants admitted for lawful temporary residence under the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. So all that to say is everyone else, everyone who's not on this list, even those who have legal immigration status, they're not eligible for these 214 programs. So that includes DACA recipients, U visa holders, and more. And we can go to the next slide. So what exactly is this rule proposing? How is it going to change the current practice? So right now what's happening is that people who aren't eligible for assistance don't receive it. Only eligible members of the household receive assistance. So as long as there's at least one U.S. citizen or eligible immigrant in a household, and this can be any member of the household, it doesn't necessarily need to be the leaseholder, that person can receive assistance. And then that house assistance is prorated based on the number of eligible individuals in the family. So right now when a family signs up for housing assistance or when they go through their regular reexamination process, which is usually yearly, they have to address this question of eligibility. And anyone who is eligible to receive assistance, and again there has to be at least one person per household, has to make a declaration declaring themselves a U.S. citizen or a non-citizen with eligible status. And if they're an eligible non-citizen, they have to provide documentation to prove it. So anyone who's not eligible to receive assistance can be excused from submitting this documentation if they do not contend to have eligible immigration status. So again, this means that their household's assistance would be prorated, so they don't receive assistance, but they're still allowed to live with their family. Next slide. And so what's going to change under the proposed rule? First, the documentation that eligible non-citizens have to submit is going to be different. Instead of currently they have to provide an original document required by the Department of Homeland Security, they're now going to have their immigration status verified through the SAVE system, which is administered by DHS. And every person in the household must be verified through this system if they're not a U.S. citizen. And that's going to include the leaseholder, it's going to include everyone. The one exception here is residents who are 62 years or older, and they're allowed to submit different documentation to verify their status. So that's going to be at least one proof of age document and another document that HUD specifies as an approved way to verify their immigration status. And this is a new process. Previously, anyone that was 62 years old or older could just submit a signed declaration saying that they were an eligible immigrant. And so now that everyone has to go through this process of verifying their status, it eliminates that do not contend option for non-citizens, and therefore eliminates the option for permanent prorating housing assistance. Temporarily prorating assistance is still allowed, but only during that short period when someone's status is being verified. Another change this rule would make is that U.S. citizens would need to provide proof of citizenship instead of just submitting a signed declaration. So this is true for all citizens regardless of age, and those documents could be a birth certificate, a naturalization certificate, a valid unexpired U.S. passport, a consular report of birth abroad, a citizenship certificate, or another document that HUD specifies. And to get really into the weeds, there is one very small exception to this whole rule. So a very small number of mixed status families are going to be able to keep their assistance, but only if they were receiving assistance on June 19th, 1995. And additionally, the head of the household or the spouse has to be eligible, and the only ineligible members that are allowed in the household are either the spouse of the head of the household, the parents of the head of the household, or their spouse, or their children. So no aunts or uncles, no siblings of the head of the household, nothing like that. So it's still pretty restrictive, and again, a very small number of people are going to qualify for this exception. So taking that small exception into account, everyone else, if anyone in their household receiving housing assistance in a 214 program can't meet these new requirements, that whole household's going to lose its housing assistance. There is a deferral period, so families have time to look for other affordable housing, and that deferral period is 6 months and can be renewed up to 3 times. These are the kind of nitty-gritty details of this rule, and my colleagues are going to talk more about the impacts and the real human costs this rule would have if it's implemented.
Great. Very good. Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it very much. Very informative. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christopher Roth. He is a senior manager in social policy at Catholic Charities USA. Christopher, go ahead.
Hi, Tony.
Oh, yeah, we can hear you just fine. Great.
Okay, great.
There you go.
Yep, so just an informational slide here on the proposed act, which I'll go over in a couple slides. So you can just go to the next one. With the proposed rule's impact, HUD itself did an actual regulatory impact analysis, which is available on the internet by them. It's very helpful, but to be completely honest, does show the negative effects pretty well in the analysis. And so in that own analysis, you can read it, and it's just to summarize, it has 3 points. Children and families could be losing their homes and potentially becoming homeless if this rule were to go in effect. The HUD recognizes that this will cause a reduction in quantity and quality of housing assistance, and it's going to cause an increase in administrative costs with HUD, and then also potentially with, we would say, with the people administering the programs, such as Catholic Charities. How that's done, well, before I just get there, the negative consequences are kind of recognized, as I said. In their analysis, they also recognize and predict that no new money would be coming in. So any cost-saving measures wouldn't help this system and wouldn't be recognized for new allocation of money. So they're openly acknowledging that. This is going to squeeze the low-income housing market, and it's likely going to cause homelessness because of it. So that's really from HUD itself, which you can see community kind of saying that, we recognize that too. And so that's going into our comments as we prepare for July 9th. HUD is seemingly hoping for mixed status families to remove themselves out of concern for this rule. They put some anticipated effects of this rule if it goes into effect in their analysis. And so, again, if you read it yourselves, you will kind of take note that HUD is anticipating the negative consequences, recognizing them, and going along with them. So that is in their own analysis. Next slide. Some of the specifics on how this proposed rule could impact low-income families. There's 25,000 mixed status families nationwide, and we recognize that in that number you're going to have U.S. taxpayers who are contributing to the economy and making a living and earning their way in the United States. In that mixed status families, the number being used is approximately 55,000 eligible children who would be affected by this if it went into effect, and 120,000 seniors could also lose housing. The other number, those are people who would be eligible for the program, but also recognizing that their families, if eligible participants cannot now partake in this system, in these HUD programs, also kind of extrapolating that into the other family members who also will be affected by that. So that's the next slide. It is kind of concentrated on 3 particular states who are really going to be affected by this. Again, analysis points out that 72% of mixed families are concentrated in 3 U.S. states. California being the biggest with 37%, New York with 12%, and then, Texas with 23%, and then New York with 12%. Then the remaining 28% or 3% or less in each state across the country. So really with the focus being on those 3 states, what we're proposing and kind of did in our research, identifying a few things with those states. One being they are high immigrant areas in some of the larger cities, not only in the country, but in those particular states. And going in tandem with that is that they're also highly expensive areas compared to the rest of the country. So if housing benefits such as HUD programs are not available to otherwise eligible participants, that's going to have an increased effect because the main areas that are affected by this are high immigrant areas, but they're also highly expensive. So a greater concern for causing homelessness with these communities. And so in our research, seeing that all the programs in these areas, all 3, are concerned and are recognizing that the people they serve will be affected by this with no clear solution as to how, with no additional funds coming through, how they would respond to that, recognizing that they don't have another way to go here for the eligible participants. Next slide. The reactions, again, in New York, California, and Texas in the housing communities, they're all submitting comments just as we are, kind of voicing their concerns and highlighting, particularly in California, they gave specific numbers of saying how this exactly will affect their areas. LA had mentioned in particular their specific numbers, and Texas as well. From the Catholic Charities perspective, we also recognize that aside from our housing programs that are affected by this, we're also anticipating other areas such as food assistance, avoiding homelessness programs that look to avoid homelessness in the first place, programs that aren't directly related to HUD, but we recognize that there's a connection there, that if this rule goes into effect, they are also going to see an increased demand for vulnerable populations, and so the entire kind of system that Catholic Charities administers in a holistic approach will be affected by this in unforeseen ways, and this is going to have unintended consequences if this proposal goes into effect. And they're all negative consequences. There really are not many positives to this rule. Okay.
And Chris, that's your last slide.
Yes, yes. So happy to answer questions at the end, but really the impact, it's pretty unanimous that this, not only from HUD, but also the advocacy community and the community that administers these programs, all recognizing that if this rule were to go in effect, it would really hurt vulnerable communities, and HUD has made some arguments as to why they're doing this. The one point that is kind of ringing true for all the three states is that while housing assistance should be expanded, it should not be done by trying to squeeze eligible participants such as mixed status households. And so, really trying to allocate more funds is the answer. This rule is not going to help communities with housing.
Very good. Thank you, Christopher. Folks, before I turn it over to the next presenter, want to remind everyone, I see that some folks have been asking questions that were easily answered here in the chat box for this webinar. But if you have any questions about the proposed rule or what's being presented, the information being given, go ahead and type them in the chat box there on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to my colleague Melissa Hastings. She is the Immigration Policy Advisor here at the USCCB Migration and Refugee Services. Melissa, go ahead.
Thanks, Tony. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just great, Melissa. Thank you.
Great, and hi, everyone. So I just want to talk and dig in a little bit more on the impacts of this proposed rule on mixed status families, and then we're going to kind of conclude by talking a little bit about what you can do and where you can find more information. So looking here both the scope and expected impacts, and Julie and Chris did a great job describing some of the scope of who would be impacted, but just as a really quick recap, because I think it bears noting again. So, HUD in its own analysis estimates that about 25,000 mixed status households are going to be impacted by this rule. And I do think it's important to flag that in those families, the vast majority of members who will be impacted, an estimated 71% actually, would otherwise be eligible for assistance. And again, as Chris mentioned, the rule is going to be having particularly disproportionate impacts on children. So as he mentioned, HUD estimates that it's about 55,000 children who will be negatively impacted by this rule. And then again, as Julie highlighted, but I think it's really important to remember, when we're talking about this and who's going to be impacted, it's not just a question of, those who are documented and those who are undocumented. So the proposed rule is also going to affect families with non-citizen members who are not specifically eligible for benefits as specified in the statute. So you remember that slide that Julie went over with all the specifically listed individuals who are eligible, and if they're not listed there, as she mentioned, then they would be ineligible. And so you're talking about individuals with DACA and with non-immigrant status. In terms of impact, so, the proposed rule would be requiring these mixed status families to basically make a choice. Either they endure family separation so that eligible family members could continue to qualify for, these really critical housing programs, or alternatively, they choose to stay together, but by doing so would forfeit any housing assistance under the proposed rule. And so just kind of breaking that down a little bit more, so on the family separation side, so not only is this, of course, creating separation, which is inhumane and contrary to our Catholic values, but it's also causing really irreparable harm, particularly to children. So as you may know, family separation can cause trauma, of course, but it can also lead to toxic stress, which has both short and long impacts. And researchers have really, pretty clearly documented the negative effects on children in terms of family separation, long-term impacts on education, on their physical health, mental health, as well as just their relationships generally. So it's really just terrible implications there. Now, the alternative, though, is that HUD expects that, rather than separating, many families will likely instead choose to forego housing assistance. But I think it's really important to flag, and when you're pushing back against this comment, to highlight the fact that the negative implications for those families are also going to be severe and long-lasting. So lack of assistance will lead for many to housing instability, which, itself can contribute to physical and mental health problems, food insecurity, educational challenges. And again, there's been substantial research that's been done on how such instability can lead children in particular to higher high school dropout rates, lower educational attainment overall as adults, depression, et cetera. And so we are deeply concerned about the impacts of this rule on mixed status families and what it means for those families and the terrible choice that it would force families to make. Tony, can you go to the next slide? All right, so then what can we do? So first, would encourage you all to learn more about the proposed rule. We really appreciate you joining this webinar, and as Tony said, the slides will be posted. You can use this as a resource and share it out with your networks. But if you're interested in reading the text of the proposed rule, I've included a link here on the slide. It's actually pretty brief, so you can feel free to take a look at. But you can also keep an eye out. We're working on a backgrounder that's just going to kind of summarize some of this information and some of the proposed changes and kind of what, why we're pushing back and why this is so problematic. And so we're going to be sending that out on our listserv. So if you're not already a member of JFI's listserv, I've included a link to sign up there. And also our domestic office, they have their Notes for Neighbors listserv. So I would also encourage you to join that if you're not already part of it. Our materials will be going to both of those groups. So second, also encouraging you to share how this proposed rule is or will impact your community. This is really critical to our advocacy efforts that we hear from you on the ground about the impacts of the proposed rule on your community specifically. So if you know of individuals who will be impacted, if you're seeing a chilling effect in your community already, and you know folks who would be willing to share their stories, please email us. I've included the JFI email address here. If privacy is a concern, we can always be identifying information and redact any of that before we use it for advocacy purposes. But it is really helpful that we hear from you. Okay, so next, and incredibly importantly, we strongly encourage you to voice your opposition to the proposed rule. So submitting comments is really your opportunity to voice your concern, to push back. Comments, as Julie said, are due by July 9th. And I'd encourage you to submit online at regulations.gov. I've included a link here, and you can go on and either use the FedReg number, or you can search by title and find it and submit your comment pretty easily. There's also, if you happen to be reading the text of the rule, you'll see that there's a mailing address as well. I just want to flag, though, that they say in those instructions that you really need to leave 2 weeks if you're going to mail a copy of your comments because of the security in their building. So at this point, we'd just really encourage folks to go online and do it online. You know, for those of you that maybe are kind of new to this process or haven't filed, you know, many comments before, I do want to flag that we did a webinar, a joint webinar last fall. It was around when the Flores and the public charge comments had come out. And the introduction to that webinar talks about the regulatory process and filing public comments, and it kind of walked through regulations.gov, how to find your rule, how to go about submitting a comment. So that might be, just as a reminder, that might be a helpful resource for you when you're actually getting ready to file, or if you have others in your network that are, you know, just a little bit non-familiar with that process. So please keep that in mind and use that as a resource. I believe Clinic also has some good materials that we can point you to as well. A couple of other, you know, just questions that we typically get when people are going to file. So first of all, there's no word limit, minimum or maximum, and you can include attachments. Comments should be unique, so we will be sending you, as soon as it's finalized, we'll be sending you a copy of the comments that we are jointly filing as CCUSA, USB, and Clinic. But just keep in mind, you're welcome to use that as a model, but if you do, it's helpful if you include some information that's unique to, you know, your experience, or at least put it in your own words so that it gets counted as a unique comment. We want to see as many unique comments as possible filed. It's really helpful, I mean, both in terms of pushing back against the agency, but also just as a delay tactic, right? Because, you know, they do have to review, consider all of the comments that get submitted. And it also helps, you know, set the groundwork for any future potential litigation. And then the last piece here that I wanted to flag is just to contact your lawmaker them to voice their opposition to the rule as well. Just as you're having conversations with them, this is something to flag. I think it's particularly important for those of you that are living or have folks you know in your network that are in those high impact states that Chris mentioned. So just very important as well, and something to bring up in your conversations. And so, you know, with that, I will stop there, Tony, and, you know, I think we can go to questions.
Great. And I think, Melissa, this question might be for you. Actually, Emily has two here. Okay, so the first one, to clarify, families receiving housing assistance since June 19th, 1995 can continue receiving these even if they are mixed?
Tony, I'm going to let Julie
go ahead.
Yeah, so my understanding is, yes, they can continue receiving the assistance, but with those caveats that the person that has eligible status has to be either the head of household or that person's spouse, and then the people that don't have the eligible status can only be those specific groups of people. So it could only be the spouse of the head of household or the head of household themselves, and then their children or parents.
So here's the follow-up to that question then. Does the original recipient of the assistance from 1995 still need to be residing in the home?
Yes, I believe so, because they would be the head of household.
I see. Great questions. For folks on the webinar, If you have any other questions, please type them in the chat box on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. While we're waiting for folks to type in other questions, I'm going to make a pitch to you folks on the webinar. If you are not already receiving the Justice for Immigrants Weekend Review or the Migration Monday email, please send me an email, and I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat box there, and I'll gladly add you to my list of recipients. We have a Weekend Review coming out tomorrow. It's the JFI Review coming out tomorrow, and we put information there on issues of importance to immigrant and refugees and the communities that we serve. So I'll put my email down in the chat box, and if other folks have any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. It looks like we have a couple of, there we go. Moises, I'm sorry. That's possible that we can open up the lines for questions. You can type your questions in the chat box there, or if you have something longer, you can email it to me. I just put in my email address, and I will share it with the other folks, with the presenters on the webinar here.
Tony, this is Melissa. A question about the Fed Reg number. So I will type this in the chat box as well, but for folks, if you want to look it up, and again, if you go to regulations.gov, you can usually find it pretty easily by the title of the rule, which is Housing and Community Development Act of 1980, verification of eligible status, and I have the link here on this slide that's up so you can see it, but the Fed Reg number is 84 Fed Reg 20589, and I'm going to type that in the box as well.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Oh, there you go. I see that there's someone typing right now. Oh, okay. It looks like Moises provided a link that has updates and advocacy materials of national housing advocates. Thank you, Moises. This is a good resource. This is a good link to have.
One thing to add about that resource is if you have anyone that wants to submit comments and only speaks Spanish or wants to submit them in Spanish, they will translate them through that way if you use the portal on that website, because unfortunately HUD is required to be submitted in English.
And Julie, Melissa, I apologize if I missed this. What is the timeline for HUD implementing any changes?
So, Tony, it's a great question, and it's one that we get, every time a proposed rule is dropped. And basically, there's not a set time frame under law to get back by. It really depends on how many comments come in. They are required to review and consider those comments. They don't have to take them, but they have to at least consider them, those that are unique. And then it just depends on how many comments they get, how long it takes them to review. So really, somewhat dependent on how many staff they put on it as well. So it could take anywhere from a couple months to a year. It really just depends.
Good to know.
There will be groups kind of making a litigation strategy in case the rule is implemented as it currently stands. There are some groups already kind of convening and brainstorming around that.
let's try to hang on the phone here for just a few more minutes. Well, I see that a couple of people are typing now, so let's let those folks. Oh, here we go. Let's let those folks continue typing. Moises, thank you for the factual information there. Goodness gracious.
Yeah, I believe Moises I spoke to in Pittsburgh, so he's out in LA. They do have good numbers out there. The Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, if you just Google that about this issue, they did put out numbers of how this affects the LA area. Obviously, high immigration community, but also very expensive area. So if you're looking for that as a reference, if you're considering making comments, I do recommend looking at what LA is dealing with if this is implemented.
Melissa, someone here tried to type in the link that you mentioned. Can you retype it again? She's having a little bit of difficulty finding the regulation.
Tony, I'm going to do you one better. I just put in a link to the regulations.gov where you can find the rule. So you can just click there, and that will take you to the rule, and then you'll see that you can comment there over to the right-hand side.
Thank you. And Anne, if you're still unable to get to it, go ahead and send us an email, and we'll. Oh, well, you're welcome. Thank you, Melissa.
Sure thing. And the just so everyone can find it, the Comment Now button is up at the top right.
And Melissa, I have not gone to that page yet. Does it compile the number of comments submitted?
It says there's been 9,006 comments received. Keep in mind that may not include comments that have been posted. You know, usually there's a little bit of a delay, particularly for mailed-in comments. And then also, I don't know that that necessarily excludes comments that aren't unique. But obviously, we're hoping that there will be a big push in the coming weeks to get that number higher.
So right now we're over 9,000. Okay. And the comments are due, what, in 2 weeks, basically?
Right. They're due July 9th. So that's that Tuesday after the 4th of July weekend.
Looks like we have 2 or 3 other folks typing questions in or comments. Well, I don't know if they're typing or, oh, here we go. So Marty has a question about HUD justifying the move. Is it saving money? Is it trying to save money? I sincerely doubt that, but I'll let one of my policy experts answer that question.
So HUD has said that they are doing this in response to that executive order saying that only people that are eligible should receive assistance in any program, and then just kind of because they're making sure all their regulations are in order, they're kind of doing a big review. So Secretary Carson has a quote saying that he's doing this to free up space for eligible citizens citizens and that the wait lists are long. And our stance and most advocates' stance is that yes, wait lists are too long. There's not enough investment in affordable housing and in additional resources for people struggling to pay for rent. But this is not the way to go about creating more space for eligible people. What we need is more investment in these types of programs, not to kick people out who are also eligible.
The other main argument you can imagine would kind of with the theme of America First, seemingly saying that if you're undocumented, you shouldn't be benefiting from any of these programs. And the law, if you read the law in the statute itself, you have to have certain statuses or U.S. citizenship to qualify for these programs. That's the whole point of the prorated system. And so, the advocacy community is making the point that that's a false argument. The way the law is written, you have to get prorated assistance only if you qualify.
So, Christopher, there's a question here. I think this might be for you. Do you know, is there a coordinated Catholic effort in California to submit comments?
I know that people in our networks have reached out looking for our comments first. I don't know where they're located at the moment, but my email address is in the slides. If they'd like to follow up with me, I can get more information on that.
But and this is a question for all three of you. So we can expect that local officials, supporters of immigrants and refugees, and homelessness, anti-homelessness advocates would probably be then responding to this, hopefully, submitting comments.
Sure, Tony, this is Melissa. Yeah, I think that's the hope. Obviously it will depend on what their individual rules are with their public position and whether or not they can submit or if they can submit in their personal capacity. But, in theory, anyone can go on, a member of the public, on behalf of your organization, et cetera, just depending on your own rules, and go in and submit a comment either for or against the rule. And obviously our hope is that as many people as possible will oppose the rule.
And one thing we have heard is that the USDA is likely to come out with a similar rule in around August. So, because the USDA also operates housing programs, they're all rural housing programs. So we'll be on the lookout for that.
Moises, thank you for the information about the coordination of efforts in Los Angeles. That is good to know. We're approaching the top of the hour, and it looks like some attendees have already dropped off. So maybe we can stay on for another couple of minutes for folks who have questions. So this is a great question from Sister Margaret Louise. How many comments does it take to make a difference or change a proposed decision? 1, 100, 1,000?
That is a wonderful question. I wish I had a straightforward answer for you. I think there's no magic number for how many comments, and if they hear a certain amount of public outcry, they're definitely going to make a change. There's nothing that mandates that they make a change. You could have one comment that's just particularly persuasive and well drafted, and that kind of sets the ground for potential litigation, and they think about it and say, we hadn't thought about that point, and they could make a change, or they could hear, 5,000 comments on something and decide to make a change, or they could look at all the comments and choose to make no changes. So there's just not really any specific number, but we have to keep in mind that the more comments that we get, whether or not they actually choose to change the rule, the more unique comments you can get, the better, because not only is it voicing, public outcry and we'll maybe think twice about it, but also it's a delay tactic, right? And so it's important, it buys time, and also, again, as I said, sets the ground. I think everyone's expecting that this likely will get litigated, and it helps kind of set that framework for the litigation. I don't know if my colleagues have anything to add.
In terms of the delay tactic, I have heard other advocates say their goal is 25,000, but again, not necessarily expecting that to be the number to cause HUD to withdraw the rule, but at least that can delay it significantly.
Well, I think 25,000 is an invitation to the folks on the phone to get 100 of their closest friends and relatives to submit a comment. Okay, we're gonna wrap it up here pretty soon. I see one more person is typing. Let's see if we can get that question in. So Anne has a question about individual comments or organizations, like an agency or a collection of agencies. What's going to be more effective?
So because of the fact that every comment needs to be unique, it's better not to have sign-on letters. It's better for as many individual comments as possible. HUD's requiring that at least 20 to 30% of the language needs to be unique. So, if you're signing on to a letter with 4 other people, it's only going to be counted once. And if those 4 other people submit slightly different unique entries, then it's counted 4 times.
But that being said, I agree with that, Julie. But that being said, if you want to submit a comment on behalf of your organization, you can also feel free to do that. I agree with the point about sign-on letters generally, but if you want your organization that you represent to have a voice in this, you can certainly feel free to submit on behalf of an organization. That's an option. You go into the comments and you click submitting on behalf of a third party. It's a little checkbox, and you can put in your organization name. And you can also submit on behalf of your organization, and you could do a separate, again, you'd want it to be unique, right? But you could always submit in your personal capacity as well. That's an option.
Great. And then the final comment that I'm going to share today is Josephine wrote down here that they provided sample comments that people can use or adapt for their own use. So Josephine, I'm going to ask you if you can send that to me. That way, if people have questions over the next 10 days or so, I can put them in touch with you or forward your message to them so that they can submit their own comments. Thank you, Josephine, for that. For everyone on the webinar, I greatly appreciate you spending an hour with us. Special thanks to my colleagues, Melissa Hayes here at Migration and Refugee Services at USCCB, Julie Bodner at USCCB Domestic and Social Development, and Christopher Ross with Catholic Charities USA. Thank you, everybody, for participating in this webinar today. We hope the information for you was helpful, and please look out for this webinar via the slides and the recording on the JFI websites tomorrow or Monday sometime during the day on Monday. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.